Kimberly. Good evening, everyone. It's my privilege to welcome our panel of distinguished guests here this evening. I'll do it in alphabetical order, starting with Bob Beatty, who is our moderator. Bob earned his PhD from Arizona State University. He's a professor of political science at Washburn University in Topeka, Kansas, and a political analyst for KSNT TV in Topeka, and a columnist for the Topeka Capital Journal. Bob has published extensively. His publications include Democracy, Asian Values in Hong Kong, Myanmar, an article in the Encyclopedia of the Developing World, and Kansas in the Political Encyclopedia of U.S. States and Regions. He's also written extensively on Kansas politics for Kansas History Journal and other publications, and has most recently covered the 2016 U.S. presidential campaign as a KSNT correspondent. In 2015, he received a research grant to study the 2016 presidential primaries and subsequently spent 2 months in Iowa on the campaign trail with all 20 of the candidates and wrote a 20-part series on the candidates, which was published in the Topeka Capital Journal. Our second guest here this evening is Richard Gams, who is an associate professor of history at Mississippi State University, where he teaches courses in U.S. political history and the history of American foreign relations. And he has been recognized by the Mississippi Humanities Council as a Humanities Teacher of the Year. He's the author of 2 books, The Eisenhower Presidency and Scientists and Statesmen, Eisenhower Science Advisors and National Security Policy, as well as several articles and essays on the Eisenhower era. His most recent essay on Eisenhower, Leadership and Decision Making, will appear in the forthcoming Blackwell Companion to the Eisenhower Presidency, scheduled for publication next year. He holds a PhD in history from the Ohio State University. He's married with 3 children and is uniquely qualified to participate in this forum, as he has a dog named Truman and a cat named Ike. James Giglio is a native Ohioan who did his undergraduate and MA work at Kent State University and his PhD at The Ohio State University. We're starting to see a trend here. He is a distinguished professor emeritus of history at Missouri State University, where he taught for 39 years. His fields were recent American history and the history of American foreign policy. He has published 8 books, including 4 on John F. Kennedy, as well as books on Tom Eagleton, Stan Musial, Harry Truman, and Warren G. Harding's Attorney General H.M. Doherty. Dr. Giglio served on the editorial board of Presidential Studies Quarterly for 8 years. His awards include being inducted into the Missouri Writers Hall of Fame. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you.
Well, I'm very excited to be here. I can't wait to hear from these gentlemen. As you heard from their biographies, I think we're all pretty excited to hear what they have to say. We are very fortunate in this area to have the Eisenhower Library and Home and the Truman Library and Home in Topeka. Charles Curtis's home is actually there as well. It doesn't get as much traffic as the other 2. And of course, in Topeka is the Brown v. Board National Historic Site, which a lot of people actually don't know about that as well. But so that era is very well covered. In fact, my brother is from Oregon, and he was so excited to go to the Eisenhower Museum when he came out recently, and then we're going to get him to the Truman Museum. But the Constitution, of course, is just a fantastic subject to look at with the presidents, and one of the reasons is it's so dynamic because a lot of the time so much is open to interpretation by us, by candidates, by the presidents, And so there's this constant debate and also throughout history as to how presidents approached the Constitution and their role, and then later debate about whether they should or should not have done certain things. One thing I've been doing since 2004 is going to Iowa for at least a month during the campaign period, and that's really when you hear a lot about the Constitution from presidential candidates. They think about it a lot. They don't talk about it as much in the general election, and I haven't quite figured out why. But in the primaries before the Iowa caucus, they talk about it a lot in small groups. So in 2004, there's a lot of discussion of President Bush and signing statements in the Constitution and things like Guantanamo and that sort of stuff. And then most recently in 2015, if you went and saw Rand Paul, you were given a Constitution at his events. Ted Cruz would look at you like this and tell you that the Constitution was being shredded. It's all very fascinating, so much discussion about the Constitution. And at one event I went to, it was an all-candidate event for Republicans, and I won't tell you which candidate, absolutely fascinating. A candidate told an elaborate story about the Constitutional Convention. And I listened to this story, and I thought, I've never heard this. I mean, this is really interesting. It's wow, this is American history. And the story was this. The story was that Benjamin Franklin, during a tense time during the Constitutional Convention, got up and made a speech and said, you know, we're having difficulty here. During the Revolutionary time, war, when things were tough, everybody asked God for help. Well, now we're having it tough again. I say, let's all get on our knees and ask God for help. And then the candidate who told this story said, and then at the Constitutional Convention, they got on their knees, prayed to God, and then got up and wrote the most incredible document in world history. And that's when I thought, wow, that is a really great story. So when I went back to Topeka, I said, I'm going to look this up. And what's interesting is that wasn't that easy because, of course, there wasn't a stenographer there. But Franklin himself ended up writing a bit about it, as did a couple other people at the convention. Here's their story. Okay? Franklin did get up and say something to the effect of, you know, maybe God can help us out here. And with Franklin, though, you never really know. I think he was being serious. But then the reaction from several of the founding fathers, there was another person who then chortled and smirked and said, well, he hasn't helped us that much in the last week or so. I don't think he'll help us today. This, that wasn't mentioned by the candidate. And so then the next question, and this is no joke, was, what'll this cost us? And we don't have any money. No kidding, because they thought maybe they had to hire a chaplain. So finally, Franklin got the idea, this is not going well, my idea to get God. And Washington says, how about next Sunday, whoever wants to go to church will march over and go to church. And that's what they did. Little different from, they all got on their knees, prayed for help, got up and wrote the Constitution. But the beauty of that is people clearly see what they want to see in the Constitution. And this can go for presidents. I see this power. I see. And so in the two chapters you wrote, you start to see how they view the Constitution. And that's why it's such a fascinating topic. Two of the presidents that we are so interested in this area, and two of the presidents who had such an impact on some big issues like Brown v. Board. We have the experts here. So I'm asked them to talk about what they feel that's most important for you to know, and then I may have some questions, but most importantly, I think, is that you'll have some questions as well. So as they're talking, if they don't talk about what you are interested in, then fire away with the questions. We'll get right to it. So Professor Dams, we'll start with you because you're closest to me, and please proceed.
Well, it's very interesting your story about Ted Cruz and the shredding of the Constitution. That's not a new idea because Eisenhower wrote fairly extensively with his brother Edgar And Edgar, as you may know, was a more conservative member of the Eisenhower family, a lawyer on the West Coast. But periodically they would talk about the issues of the day, and especially in the late 40s and early 50s, there's some correspondence where the possibility of Eisenhower becoming a candidate for public office comes up. And Edgar goes into a fairly long diatribe about the terrible state of the nation, that the evils of the New Deal and the Fair Deal, the abuses of power by the legislature, the judiciary, and the presidency had essentially shredded the Constitution. And this is what he writes to Eisenhower in 51. It seems to be encouraging his brother to agree with him and say, yes, I would never get involved in this messy politics business. But Eisenhower responds in a very positive way about the Constitution, and he argues that this is the best system of government that's ever been devised. And he takes the perspective that, and for that reason, if you really feel that the Constitution is being subverted in some way or shredded, then the founders would expect you, as a good, loyal Republican with a small r, to become involved in the process and make things better. So Eisenhower comes to the presidency with a certain amount of reverence and respect for the Constitution, at least what he understands the Constitution to be. He agrees with some of his brother's critique about what he sees the excesses of previous administrations from the 1930s and through World War II, and then the Truman years. He does believe that the federal government has become too powerful, too overarching, is beginning to impinge on people's liberties. But he thinks this is one of the reasons to become involved in the presidential race. He sees this as partly an effort to rescue the Republican Party from the isolationist foreign policy of the Taft wing of the party. But he also sees it as necessary to have a viable alternative to the Democratic Party, because he is coming to the conclusion that actually the Constitution itself is under threat. And if the Democrats win yet another presidential election, then it could very well be too late to resuscitate the Constitution. So going all the way back to Eisenhower's original reasons for getting involved as a presidential candidate, I think the Constitution is very much one of the underlying reasons, not just, as we often hear, concern about preserving the containment foreign policy in the face of criticism from his own party. Following on from that, it's sort of interesting that the very first constitutional issue that Eisenhower has to deal with is on the first day of the 83rd Congress, when a member of his own party, Senator John Bricker of Ohio, introduces a resolution that Bricker believes is essential for turning back some of the excesses of presidential power. Bricker is concerned at what he sees as the unconstitutional agreements that Roosevelt and Truman have entered into in the course of World War II and the Cold War. Bricker and several of his like-minded Republicans concluded that executive agreements, regardless of what the Supreme Court had ruled in a couple of cases in the 1930s and the 40s, executive agreements were unconstitutional methods of tying the United States into international organizations like the UN. So Bricker introduces a constitutional amendment which has the backing of, I believe, 64 senators when it's first introduced, laying out what he thinks are three important conditions that need to be added to the Constitution to limit the treaty-making power and the negotiating power of the president. The first is that no treaty should be made that in any way violates the Constitution, which was something that John Foster Dulles and Eisenhower were actually quite willing to accept. They thought that realistically no president would ever sign a treaty that would violate the Constitution, and certainly no Senate would ratify a treaty that would violate the Constitution. But they were willing to maybe concede that point to Bricker. But then the second and third parts of the Bricker Amendment were things that Eisenhower found completely unpalatable because he thought that they were a flagrant violation of the principle of the separation of powers. One of the provisions of the Brooker Amendment was that if any treaty were made, it could only go into effect provided Congress enact special implementing legislation, and that legislation would only be valid if that legislation could have been made without the treaty having been put into effect. What his argument was, there had been a number of agreements the United States had signed going all the way back to the early 20th century that had given the federal government powers that were not specified in the Constitution. And this so-called treaty law, as Bricker and his supporters saw it, was a subtle way of subverting the intent of the framers of the Constitution. And then the third part of the Bricker Amendment was executive agreements must be subject to congressional confirmation in the same way that treaties had to be ratified. This becomes a huge political problem for Eisenhower because a majority of the Republican Party rallies behind the Bricker Amendment. Eisenhower sees it as really, it's going to be hamstring the hands of the president in the conduct of foreign policy. He points out to anyone who will listen to him that executive agreements are a necessary part for implementing treaties in some cases. Executive agreements are necessary preconditions for reaching formal agreements in treaties. And so he worries that this is going to force the United States to relinquish its world role. He's not very adept at making this case initially. He tries to work behind the scenes. He tries to get surrogates to do his bidding. Fred Greenstein has a famous book about the hidden hand presidency. He tries to get allies in the Democratic Party to work to water down the Bricker Amendment. And it's only very late in the day. It's only in 1954 when it looks like there's going to actually be a vote on this that Eisenhower finally comes out and says very explicitly that this is something he cannot countenance. He tells the Senate Majority Leader, William Nolan, that he is absolutely opposed to the Bricker Amendment. And through a variety of schemes in the U.S. Senate, partly relying on the support of Democrats, Eisenhower is able, first of all, to water down the Bricker Amendment. He's then able to get a substitute amendment introduced. And finally, the substitute amendment is also voted down, but by one vote. There's a majority in favor of some version of the Bricker Amendment, but it doesn't have the necessary two-thirds of a majority to go through the Senate and become part of the Constitution. So Eisenhower is very perplexed at the time he becomes president. He's perplexed at what he sees as the erosion of federalism, the over-centralization of the federal government, but his very first constitutional crisis actually comes from his political right. It comes from members of his own party. I think at that point we probably should let Professor Giglio have a word.
Okay. The punchline to your story about Franklin and prayer at a very difficult moment at the Constitutional Convention was Hamilton's retort that we don't have to rely on foreign aid.
Okay.
I hope you can hear me, and thank you for being here this evening. First of all, these two presidents that we're discussing tonight, in recent polls by scholars of the presidency, have ranked both of them high. Truman about 5, Eisenhower 8 or 9. So they were very successful, but that does not mean that you can't be critical. Historians are supposed to be that as well. I want to talk about Truman's conception of constitutional power. And I'm going to deal with two issues here regarding that. One of which is this idea that there's inherent power constitutionally that the president has. Never completely defined that. He mentioned Jefferson. Jefferson brought in the Louisiana Purchase, without any clear constitutional authority. He admired strong presidents, whether they be Jackson or Lincoln or Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, or Franklin Roosevelt. Now, in the context of his presidency, I want to deal with that inherent power in the discussion of the Korean War. I think that was an important constitutional history question that would come up. As you probably know, North Korea and South Korea were divided after World War II. The grandfather of the leader of North Korea has a grandson now who heads South Korea. They were both dictators. The leader of South Korea was autocratic, but we supported him. What happened here in June of 1950, North Korea attacked South Korea. I need a prop or two here. You can see Korea here in the middle of Korea, north of Seoul, is the 38th parallel. That was the dividing point. And North Korea crossed the 38th parallel. The Truman administration felt that all of this was engineered by the Soviet Union. Stalin was responsible for it. But the fact is, the leader of North Korea, Kim Il-sung, was a nationalist, and he wanted to unify Korea. I think Syngman Rhee of South Korea wanted to do the same thing. And so there was a misconception here on the part of the Truman administration. The important thing is that Truman did not ask for a declaration of war. He wanted to work through the UN. Congress was ignored about it. There were only 2 senators who complained. One was Robert Taft of Ohio, and the other one was Ken Gormley of Nebraska. So there was an abdication of power on the part of Congress because, according to the Constitution, that is a shared responsibility. And in honor of Mr. Ken here, I have here a copy of the Constitution. Congress does have the power to declare war, but the President is the commander-in-chief, and there has to be joint involvement between the two. What I discovered in writing a book on Tom Eagleton was that there was something else involved here. In 1945, Congress passed what was called the United Nations Participation Act. What was in that act was this statement, that the President could not use American forces through the UN without the approval of Congress. Nobody complained about this at this particular point. General MacArthur became the UN commander, and in the initial phase of the war, MacArthur was very successful, as you probably know. The North Koreans were in retreat. They crossed the 38th parallel, the UN forces did, which raised another issue. The initial objective of the UN was containment. Now we were moving from containment to liberation, again without the consultation of the Congress. And MacArthur was pushing this. Truman, dealing with a very contentious off-term congressional election, was very much wanting to have success in this war. And so what happened was the decision was to move northward, which the UN forces did, reaching the northern part of the country, very close to the Yalu River. I don't know if you can see that river. I can't reach it. But China provided warning on a number of occasions through India, and what eventually happened was the intervention of China in this war. And the American forces were moved backward and back across to 38th parallel again. And the administration had to change its objective from containment, or from liberation to containment. And it was an unsettled matter. Public opinion now shifted against the administration, but MacArthur ignored all of that. He wanted to extend the war by enlarging the conflict, by unleashing Chiang Kai-shek, using some of his forces in Korea, perhaps in a diversionary sense against China on the mainland. There was some discussion of tactical nuclear weapons, of bombing Chinese targets industrially as well as military. And it was at this point, and this was the decision that was made correctly by Truman, that we could not extend the war any further and extend American lives more than we have. And what happened was there was an attempt to negotiate with the communists, but that did not work out. MacArthur was recalled. He was recalled by the Truman administration, and that created greater hostility against Truman. As a consequence of that, his popularity went down to about 31%. But if he had followed the Constitution early, he would have not lost as much as a consequence of what was to occur. And of course, Eisenhower now was a candidate for the Republican Party. Eisenhower said that he would go to Korea and try to study the situation and pursue a resolution to that war. The reason why I have said all of this, it's my personal belief that what we did in Korea had an impact on how we entered through the use of combat forces in Vietnam as it relates to the Gulf of Tonkin resolution that occurred partly in fabrication. There was no evidence that the second American destroyer was attacked, the Turner Joy. But again, in studying this, view the Congress as not responding, I think, as well as it should have. The debate in the House of Representatives that would have given Johnson carte blanche in Vietnam to overturn the aggression there was a vote of something like 435-0. The vote in the Senate, with very little debate, was almost unanimous. 2 senators opposed that open-ended resolution which extended American combat forces in Vietnam that prior did not exist until this time. So I've often wondered, if we had responded differently in Korea, would the situation have been any different? Again, we're talking about shared power here constitutionally. The president made mistakes, but Congress as well made mistakes, which subsequently led to the War Powers Act that Eagleton attempted to get through Congress. He was one of 3 sponsors of it in 1971. but it was so watered down subsequently in 1973 and so often violated that it had no impact on presidential action in various military escapades that would follow. So that's one example that I used in my book. The other one was the steel seizure case. 1951. Truman's popularity was on the wane at that time because of Korea. The United Steelworkers wanted an increase of 36 cents per hour because they had not had an increase for several years. And there was some discussion about this. The steel companies finally said, we can't support any increase in wages unless the price of steel would go up. Initially, they wanted $12 a ton. We were in the midst of war. We needed steel. Truman was the commander-in-chief. To avert a strike, which was certain at this point, Truman decided, as commander-in-chief, using his inherent powers, took over the steel mills. And the steel mills were to be operated by the Secretary of Commerce, Sawyer. So that was the situation. Of course, this became a judicial issue. It became a constitutional one. Truman thought that he would win constitutionally because all 9 judges were appointed by either Roosevelt or Truman. And he had some inkling from the Chief Justice, Vincent, that you should get a favorable vote from this. Well, it never turned out that way. By a 6-3 vote, Truman's actions were overturned. They were overturned because Truman used powers that had been originally given to Congress through the Taft-Hartley Act. The Taft-Hartley Act should have been brought into play. That would have provided for an 80-day cooling off period and further negotiation. Quite probably there would have been some sort of settlement as a consequence of that. Another question that came up by a couple of justices was the fact that Truman did not properly declare war in Korea. So that became an issue as well. Now, the steel seizure case was not, I think, a major issue in the presidential campaign, but certainly Korea was. And I hate to finish in a critical note because I sincerely like Harry Truman. I wrote a good book about him, but those are the facts. The one thing that I have not yet had time to talk about, and maybe we'll get into this subsequently, is the issue of race and civil rights regarding Harry Truman, because he was on both sides of the issue regarding that as well.
Yeah, let's, before we get to questions, civil rights, I think, is the natural thing we should talk about next. We'll start with President Eisenhower and your chapter in this great book, which you can also use as a weight. It's fabulous. I love it.
Only that much is my chapter.
You discuss...
You're not going to hold that in bed either.
You discuss several issues around civil rights, which are fascinating. The Little Rock crisis, the Brown case. What would you like to talk about in terms of the president and civil rights?
Yeah, I think there's, I mean, obviously, in terms of constitutional issues, the civil rights, the whole civil rights issue is one of the big episodes in the Eisenhower years. I think the first thing that we should point to is that Eisenhower did not really want to get involved in the civil rights struggles of the 1950s. His view of federalism was that many of these issues, if not all of them, should really be resolved at the local level and the state level, and that as much as possible, the federal government should avoid trying to step in and take a position on a lot of these questions. Now, the one exception is in those areas where Eisenhower believed that as president he had a clear constitutional duty and a clear constitutional capability to act. So very early in his presidency, he does, for example, follow through on the completing the integration of the armed forces begun under Truman. It's under Eisenhower that this is finally fulfilled during the Korean War period. But as commander-in-chief, he believed he had certain powers that allowed him to do this. Similarly, in Washington, D.C., where integration there in public accommodations is accomplished fairly early in the Eisenhower years, this was a unique situation where the federal authority was able to act. But he really did not want to get involved in the Brown versus Board of Education cases, and they also originate in the Truman years. We're sort of doing this backwards chronologically, I think. But when those cases were up to be re-argued, Supreme Court asked for re-argument of those cases in 1953, Eisenhower was extremely reluctant to have the administration take a stand. And he had to be persuaded by his attorney general that actually what the court was asking for was a friend of the court brief, which was quite a usual procedure. Eisenhower was worried that somehow by having his administration express an opinion on the merits of these cases, that this was sort of crossing the line between the executive responsibility and the judiciary's responsibilities. So Herbert Brownell writes a brief in which he makes a strong case that under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, the rights of these African-American school children were being abridged as a result of segregated public education. Eisenhower avoids making any sort of public comment on the issues leading up to the Brown case. When the Brown ruling is issued in May of 1954, he states that this is now the law of the land, but again, he doesn't come out and make a clear case that he is fully behind that decision. In fact, he says on several occasions that his opinion doesn't matter. Whether he believes it's a correct decision or not doesn't matter. It is now the law of the land. But his view is that the Brown decision should only be implemented in a very step-by-step, gradual process over a long period of time. He worries, and we see this in his correspondence with a number of Southern governors and some of his close associates. He worries that if there is an immediate change in the racial status quo, if immediately school systems in the South are being forced to integrate, that will eventually destroy those public school systems. Because he worries that white children will be withdrawn from the public schools entirely, or other means will be found to undermine the intent of the Brown decision. And interestingly, in the second Brown decision, the decision over how school integration will actually be implemented, at that point, Eisenhower does personally become involved in helping to shape the administration's brief for the Supreme Court. And he inserts language into that brief which emphasizes gradualism and integration, not necessarily immediately, but as it becomes feasible. So he very much wants to make this a slow, evolving process, probably beginning with the universities, then gradually going down to the high schools with the upper grades, and then eventually down to elementary schools. He envisions a process that will take years, if not a decade, finally to be implemented. So Eisenhower's view on this is he makes a number of speeches in which he talks about justice. And the implication seems to be that he supports school integration as a matter of justice. But he also tells Southern leaders the same thing, and they interpret it somewhat differently. They put a different slant on what he means by justice. And of course, in the Little Rock crisis, where Eisenhower's hand is forced, he believes he has no choice but to intervene with federal troops when a Southern governor defies a federal court order. But he makes a case, again, in his press conference and in his speech on the eve of sending American troops to Little Rock. He makes the case that he is acting to uphold a court order. He's acting to uphold the law. He is not acting to force integration, although that might, in fact, be the practical reality of what he's doing.
Civil rights, Professor?
Sure. There are some historians who argue that Harry Truman was our first civil rights president in the 20th century. And one can make a case for that up to a point. When he was campaigning for re-election to the Senate in 1940, in White Sedalia, Missouri, he delivered a speech on civil rights. And once he became president, he created a committee on civil rights, bringing together a number of liberals on that committee that published a document to secure our rights. A long list of things: the desegregation of our armed forces, an anti-lynching bill, an anti-poll tax bill, a strong civil rights division in the Department of Justice. And he tried, as president, to legislate or get Congress to legislate many of these recommendations. They all failed. But in July of 1948, by executive order, he desegregated the armed forces. Eisenhower completed it in 52, but I don't know whether he could have done anything else at that time. But there's another side to Truman. He was not supportive enough of the social interaction of the two races. And there's a number of examples of that that come out, particularly after he left the presidency. One of which involved the sit-ins, which began in 1960. He opposed them. He thought it was wrong. A person who owned a store or a company, he thought had the right to exclude people if they wanted to. There was a private letter that Dean Acheson wrote to Truman in this period. He says, at heart, all you Missourians are Confederates. Study the Constitution, he said. And Acheson was right, because what followed was this. When you had a sit-in, and if the police powers of the state were involved with that, that becomes a state or constitutional issue. And the 14th Amendment, the equal protection under the laws, comes into play. And each case was taken individually for a number of months, and the federal government won a number of these cases, provided that those who sat at the lunch counters were peaceful and they were physically removed. And ultimately, this led to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which had an accommodation clause written into that particular law. Truman was not very fond of Martin Luther King Jr. either. He called him our nation's #1 troublemaker. This was in his post-presidency. And it was suggested, well, he won the Nobel Peace Prize. He said Truman did. Well, I didn't give it to him. And Truman did not endorse the Brown case until very late in his life. And, you know, he was concerned as well about the situation related to that, as you specified, as to what might happen in the South, that this might create hostility, racial conflict, private schools, this sort of thing. But another concern of Truman was the unity of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party's strength, one of its strengths, was in the South. And once civil rights became a major issue, and it began with the Kennedy administration into Johnson, we all know what happened. The Democratic Party no longer had the support in the South that it once had. It was a new ball game. It created a realignment, which certainly exhibited itself in the Nixon era and subsequently. But again, it's mixed about Harry Truman. He was, like Eisenhower, I think, you know, one who came out of a certain environment, and it was very difficult on some issues relating to race to depart from that.
All right, questions? We're ready for questions. Yes, sir.
I think Truman wrote a letter.
Oh, here's the microphone.
Okay. I think Truman wrote a letter to Roy Wilkins, head of the NAACP, after he got some kickback from that comment about Martin Luther King being a troublemaker. And he said that he believed that civil rights or human rights are more important than property rights, but property rights are important too. And then he softened his position to indicate that he still believed in justice for minorities. And Roy Wilkins was very generous in accepting that, because he said that he was the first president to really do something to equalize rights for minorities. So he was getting kind of cranky and crusty, I think, in his late years.
Call him a transitional president regarding that, but it wasn't age that affected Truman, because there was a core activity in Chicago in 1944 regarding the lunch counters there. And Truman took the same position in 1944 when he was in the Senate.
Yes, sir.
We've got another question right here.
I think you're right there.
I wonder if any of the three of you could go into a little bit more detail relating to the relationship between the Congress and the President on war issues. It seems to me that consistently for a long period of time, one group, the Congress has blamed the presidents relating to wars, and the President has blamed the inaction of the Congress in relation to wars. So can you take us back a little bit into the lack of declaration of war in Korea, and go into a little bit more detail on why that wasn't done and what you feel that led to?
Well, you know, back then, partisanships in terms of foreign policy stopped at the water's edge. And generally, there was cooperation between the President and Congress on a number of issues regarding foreign policy. There was an international faction in the Republican Party headed by Vandenberg, the senator from Michigan. So on many issues, Truman had the support of the Republicans in Congress. there were a number of things, the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, NATO, all of that. No opposition regarding Korea aside from some Asia First elements, and they were very small, like Taft. We didn't have the problem that we have today, unfortunately, today. Back then, there was a consensus regarding containment. And Truman and Eisenhower, despite their differences, always believed that we needed a strong unity in Europe through NATO. That was one reason Eisenhower ran for the presidency. He didn't want to see Bob Taft get nominated. So, you know, there was that support that we don't have, unfortunately, today.
I think to go back to a point that you raised earlier regarding the sort of the evolution of the political situation that eventually led to the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. There's a couple of things that happened in between the Korean War and the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. There's two occasions where Eisenhower actually goes to Congress to get authorization for a situation that could very well lead to something like another Korean War. But I think he's sort of learned from the experience of Truman that he needs to get Congress on board from the very beginning. So there's the Formosa Resolution. At the time that the United States negotiates a mutual defense treaty with Formosa, Taiwan. This is a resolution that is passed and gives the Eisenhower administration a great deal of leeway to possibly use military force in defense of Formosa and various other offshore islands which were left deliberately ambiguous. And then a little bit later on, after the Suez affair, there's the Middle East Resolution, 1957 or 8, 57, which also gives the president a great deal of leeway to possibly take action in the Middle East to contain communism. So Congress, for the most part, is supportive of the internationalist policies of the Eisenhower administration to the extent that they are even, it could be argued, voluntarily giving up some of their ability to declare a state of war. They're already giving the President Love the authorization he needs to use military force in certain circumstances.
Yeah. Much to Atchison's chagrin sometimes, because he told Truman, we don't have to support them on all those issues. But Truman was adamant that we should support Eisenhower on issues related to, well, for example, the Middle East.
More questions. We have a little bit of time. There's one in the back.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of follow up on that. You suggested that that because of the way Korea was conducted, that maybe that influenced the way the Vietnam War unfolded, and sort of the Congress not stepping in to declare war and whatnot. How? Talk a little bit about the role of the UN, because obviously that was something very important to Truman, very important in the Korean context, and not really so much a factor in the Vietnam. How does that play into A, anything that Truman might have been thinking, and B, anything that Eisenhower may have learned or chosen to do or not to do based on his attitude about the UN?
Well, regarding Korea, of course, we had always the support of the United Nations. I don't know if there was very much discussion when we decided to move across the 38th parallel. Things began to change, of course, subsequently, but maybe that created a little bit of arrogance on our part that we would always have the support of the UN. You know, nationalism begins to come into play subsequently too, where we sometimes misinterpreted opposition to us by various dissident groups that had a communist flavor as seeing this as a monolith tied to the Soviet Union. We never had a great appreciation for the nationalistic forces that were at work in the Third World. For example, in 1960, 18 new countries came into existence in Africa alone. Kennedy, more so. But even regarding Vietnam, Kennedy did not appreciate the nationalistic side of that war, and that got him into some difficulties. Of course, by then we lost control of the United Nations.
I was wondering if the gentleman in the center could talk, though, within the Suez crisis, where France and Britain ignore the UN, and then Eisenhower pulls the economic rug out from underneath Britain and gets mad at him, and then the UN brings in the first peacekeeping point, basically. Can you talk a little bit about Eisenhower and his attitude?
Yes, certainly. Yeah. It's not just that Britain, France, and Israel ignore the UN. What really upsets Eisenhower is they ignore Eisenhower. Because he'd been telling them for months that, you know, we agree that what has happened to the Suez Canal is unacceptable, but there must be a diplomatic solution. We will back you, but it must be through peaceful means. And Anthony Eden, the British Prime Minister, believes that Eisenhower and Dulles are not fully aware of the blow that this has struck to British interests in the Middle East, and specifically, obviously, in Egypt. He also, Eden believes that when push comes to shove, that Dulles and Eisenhower will back him if he decides to use military force. Tremendous miscalculation. And then when the invasion does take place, Eisenhower is furious because it diverts attention from two things. It diverts attention from what the Soviets are up to in Hungary, which he's been hoping that he can use in the UN to whip up international condemnation. And it also distracts from the presidential election, which is taking place at that very moment. So Eisenhower is furious with Eden, but he understands that ultimately he needs to continue to work with the British and the French. So he tells Dulles to go off, write a resolution, condemn as much as we have to, but not so much to the point that it's going to destroy the relationship within NATO. Subsequently, the French and the British draw two different lessons from Suez. The British draw the lesson, we can never again be separated from the United States. We have to work with the United States to the extent possible to defend our interests. The French draw the lesson, you can't rely on the United States. We have to go our own way to protect our own interests.
Rich, I have a question.
Yes, sir.
Why did Eisenhower consent to that last U-2 flight on the eve of the Paris Peace Conference when so much was at stake at that time? Could that much have been gained by that?
That's an excellent question. And every U-2 flight, every U-2 series of flights was personally approved in the Oval Office by Eisenhower. Wow. It was a tremendous miscalculation on his part. Having said that, he had been assured that the U-2 is invulnerable. If something does go wrong, there's no way the pilot could survive a crash. If the pilot does survive a crash, there's the cyanide pin that they're not obligated to use, but the understanding was the pilot would not be taken alive. So everything that could go wrong did go wrong.
Right.
And then the administration compounds matters by putting out these cover stories that, first of all, it's a weather aircraft that has maybe flown off course, it's a NASA research plane, something must have gone terribly wrong, and then Khrushchev produces the wreckage, the film, and the pilot. Not one of Eisenhower's finest moments.
There's a question.
post-war period is kind of the beginning of the U.S. getting more and more involved in covert operations. And I'm wondering if these presidents had any concerns that they were violating, if not the letter of the Constitution, perhaps the spirit of the Constitution, or were they completely unconcerned with that?
That's yours.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Eisenhower authorizes a great deal of covert operations. He sees this as necessary. He sees this as, I would argue, justified from the perspective of defending national interests, helping allies, and so forth. I don't know that I've come across anything that suggests to me Eisenhower thought this was unconstitutional. I think he considered this part of his necessary executive powers. And for the most part, of course, he enjoys success, at least in the short term. Long term, some of these covert interventions have horrendous consequences. But at the time, it seemed that this was containment on the cheap.
I think we have time for one more question, right here in the front.
This is one of those what-if questions. What do you think would, in view of the crisis in the Middle East today, what do you think approach Truman would have taken, and what approach do you think Eisenhower would have taken? I realize there's been a lot of time and a lot of different actions taking place, but what do you think that they in their wisdom and in their commanding obligations that they would have?
You mean with Iraq,
Yeah.
Afghanistan, Syria, sort of that
Yes,
whole,
yes.
okay.
Well, I think you would have to go back to the election between Gore and George W. Bush. I think if Gore were elected, I don't think that we would have done what we did in creating out of 9/11 the decision to go into Iraq. I don't see that. There's a lot of speculation as to why the Bush administration did it. Economic, oil, all of that, and the neocons' desire to democratize the Middle East is another possibility. You can go on and on about that. But the one thing that Trump has said that is correct, even though his original position on the war is subject to scrutiny, that we destabilize the Middle East because of the existing balance of power between Iraq and Iran. We did that, and that was a terrible mistake. We have to think about more, when is it prudent to use our military forces in such areas as we have when our national security is not directly at stake? That is something that, we have to reconsider in our military commitments on foreign soil. And I think both Democratic and Republican parties have made mistakes over time in terms of that. So, one thing Colin Powell said, once you get into something like that and you break it, you have to fix it. And it's not so easy to fix. I think today, Iraq is a fig leaf. I don't think it will ever emerge as a unified country. I think that probably Biden was right. The best we could possibly have there is a confederation. But we're not going to have Sunnis and Shia and Kurds come together in a way that it once existed. You know, the one thing you can say about Saddam, and it's not good enough, but he kept that country whole, as Marshal Tito kept Yugoslavia whole. The wrong ways of doing it occurred in both of those regimes, but the fact was there was some sort of stabilization there. Many people lost their lives as a consequence of that. But again, we have to be more prudent in terms of deciding where we use our American forces.
I can't really comment on current affairs, but I can maybe comment a couple of things regarding Eisenhower in the Middle East. One thing to bear in mind is that Eisenhower has to deal with a Middle East that's going through quite a bit of turmoil in his day. But for most of his administration, at least the first term of his administration, he takes the view that the Arab-Israeli dispute is a powder keg, a potential powder keg, and this is something that the United States and its allies must work together to contain. And he pushes a number of initiatives whereby he tries to appear as the honest broker between Israel and the surrounding Arab states. And he puts a great deal of pressure on the Israelis to try to come to terms with some of their enemies. So he takes the view that one of the fundamental issues that has to be resolved is the Arab-Israeli dispute. It's only somewhat later, in the 1960s, that the United States develops a much closer relationship with Israel. Eisenhower is always sort of holding Israel at arm's length. Second thing I would say about Eisenhower in the Middle East in the 1950s is he believes that, for the moment at least, the United States has to work with strong figures in the region who can keep the lid on some of the rising nationalist movements that are coming from below, even if they're unpalatable. There's a revolution in Iraq in 1958. The monarchy is overthrown. The British are throwing up their hands because they've lost another of their clients in the Middle East. But Eisenhower's approach is, we may not like this military regime, the Qassim regime that comes to power, but we have to find some way to accommodate ourselves to them and work with them. So sort of jumping forward a couple of generations with Saddam Hussein, I don't think Eisenhower would have been quick to go in and try to remove a Middle Eastern leader such as Saddam Hussein. Next door in Iran, 1953, Eisenhower is very much behind the covert operation that leads to the Shah of Iran assuming greater authority over that country. So partly because of the nature of the region in that historical time period, perhaps, Eisenhower was looking to work with some of these maybe unsavory, maybe unpalatable, but people who could keep stability.
I think we are finished with I'm looking at Dr. Beatty here to confirm.
Oh, I could go on all night, but you're in charge of it.
Not everyone wants to spend the night at the National Archives. It's not quite like night at the museum.
I do.
We can make it close. I want to thank our guests.
The Kansas-Nebraska Act comes to life.
It's actually been here, but it's not right now. We want to thank our guests, Dr. Beatty, Dr. Dance, Dr. Giglio, for being with us. Please give them a round of applause.